A very good day. You're watching CNN. I'm Richard Quest in New York, sitting in today for Julia. I begin with the latest from Ukraine. Only hours after the country said it would try again to get civilians out of a steel plant in Mariupol, an official there says Russian forces blocked off a potential escape route near the Azovstal complex. An operation to evacuate the complex had been scheduled for today. Hundreds of people are thought to be sheltering inside the plant, which has now become symbolic of Ukraine's resistance in the eastern part of the country. There have been heavy strikes and counter-strikes in Donetsk region. These are images of a fuel depot that was set alight in an area controlled by Russian-backed forces. Elsewhere, a Ukrainian rail hub and supply line was hit, and the Ukrainian military says shelling is intense along the entire line of contact in the Donetsk and Luhansk region. US officials are acknowledging Russian forces are making progress. They describe it as slow and uneven. President Zelensky is accusing the Russians of carrying out 5 missile strikes on the capital, Kyiv, while the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was wrapping up his visit to the city. Several people were injured when an apartment building was struck, setting it on fire. President Zelensky says the attack reveals what Russian intentions truly are.
Today, immediately after the end of our talks in Kyiv, Russian missiles flew into the city. 5 missiles. This says a lot about Russia's true attitude to global institutions, about the Russian leadership's efforts to humiliate the UN and everything that the organization represents, and therefore requires an appropriate, powerful response.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin has accepted an invitation to attend the G20 summit in November, according to the host of the summit, Indonesian leader Joko Widodo. He says he's also invited Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. This is what the Pentagon press secretary said when asked if Mr. Putin should be welcomed at the G20.
No, he absolutely shouldn't be. I mean, he has isolated Russia by his own actions, and he should continue to be isolated by the international community. Look, I can't speak for President Biden or what the schedule might offer for the president and for United States attendance, but it's inappropriate, I think, for the entire international community to keep treating Russia as if things are normal, because it's not.
Russian forces are making advances in southern Ukraine. For many civilians near the front lines, the evacuation is as dangerous as sheltering in place. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh reports.
If Moscow had any surprises left in this war, it is along here. The other side of the river has been Russia's for weeks, but here, the western side, is caught in the fast-changing landscape of this week's push. That's the prize over there, the Dnieper River, up past which on the left side bank here the Russians are trying to push, wanting control of both sides of that vital part of Ukraine. Here in Novovoronskovo, we are told there are a handful of Russian tanks just over a kilometre away on its outskirts, pushing, probing, but ultimately kept at bay by Ukrainian forces that still hold the town. Brazilians here, embodied in Ludmila, under the threat of rocket fire, planting onions. I'm here until victory, she said.
Mama сейчас и я. Дети выехали.
Our children have gone, it's just her and her mother. Сколько лет ваша мама?
80.
Okay, her 80-year-old mother and her are staying here.
Мама сказала, никуда не уеду, а я ее не брошу.
Her mother says she's not going anywhere and she's not going to leave her alone.
У меня окна целые пока, да.
All her windows are blown out, she says. Ukrainian forces who don't want their positions filmed are dotted around the town, as too are the signs of innocent lives lost here. Rockets peeking out from under the water. And this boat in which 14 civilians tried to flee Russian occupation on April the 7th, 4 of them died when Moscow's troops opened fire when it was 70 meters out. Yet still, the desperate keep fleeing. This morning, these women left behind their men to defend their homes near Novovorontsovka.
Бежали, рано утром бежали.
We ran early in the morning, said Luda. They didn't let us out. We're shields for them. They don't let us out, and by foot and by bicycle we go. In the fields we ran. Our soldiers were 2 kilometers away, Nadezhda adds, and we ran to them. What they need, the Russians take, she said. Take cars. They draw Zs on everything. As their new unwanted guests demanded milk and food at gunpoint, they had a glimpse of their warped mindset. They say they've come to liberate us, Luda said. These aggressors, that's what they told us. They say America is fighting here, but using the hands of Ukrainians to do it. That's what they say. Another claim to be fueled by the violence of the long war with separatists in the east. In general, the Donetsk militants say, she said, you have been bombing us for 8 years. Now we bomb you. Across the fields, loathing and artillery swallow whole once happy worlds.
Joining me now is Nick Payton-Walsh, who is with us now. Nick, the situation that we are seeing, the deteriorating situation, it's difficult to judge, isn't it? At one point where the US says that Russia is making small advances, but they are making advances. And on the other side, we're hearing that the Ukrainians are also holding very strong lines. How do you judge the position at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say in overall that Russia is making some small gains here, and that may be something which increases over time. Certainly here in the southern areas, these vast rural expanses with villages scattered between them, it's very hard to really give you a sense of who the ultimate winner is at this point. While Russia clearly takes some village on one day, moves forward in one area, Ukraine moves in to their west in certain areas to the south of where I am and has victories there. It is back and forth constantly. But the important thing to remember here is this is the second time Russia has tried to bring its forces to bear and en masse push through Ukraine's countryside here in the south, but also in the east as well. And it is slow going. So your question is how much energy, how much sort of resource do they have left to pour into this until that begins to drain on the Russian side too, Richard?
One thing to just get your take on, if we may, with your wider foreign policy experience. The G20, President Putin is now saying he will attend the G20 in Indonesia in November. I guess that's going to absolutely put the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of nobody else will want to be seen with him. It's very difficult to see how that will proceed.
Yeah, it is tough to imagine how the G20, the world's richest nations, will all comfortably stand around a man. But it will also, I think, possibly reflect on how sanctions across the world are certainly united when it comes to Western nations, but not a universal thing around the entire globe. And so it'll be a fundamental question, I think, will end up being whether or not Western leaders decide to not go. I think that would damage the G20 as a premise, but they decide to go and then have images on stage where they stand meters apart from the Kremlin head. But November, Richard, is a long way away. And I think, we did not imagine last November that we could possibly be standing here talking about the largest land war in Europe since 1945. Certainly, I'm sure there were many in Ukraine who would desperately hope the war will have stopped taking so many lives by then. It's doubtful if Russia, frankly, have the juice to keep going that long in the way that they're doing right now. But still, this certainly, I think, raises the issue of, is the Western shunning of Russia in all ways, in the economy and the political sphere of the world, emulated by the other rich nations of this world, and quite where will we be geopolitically in this frankly new global landscape since Russia had this decision to unprovokedly invade Ukraine at the end of the year? Richard?
Nick Payton-Walsh, very grateful. Thank you, sir. Staying with what's happening in Russia, the Russian central bank has cut its benchmark interest rate by a full 3 percentage points to 14% today. And this is as Western sanctions against Moscow intensify, and there are prospects of more, because Russia is bracing for what could be a total EU ban on oil initially and maybe gas later. Oil's higher, where you can see the numbers on the screen. Germany apparently is ready to support a Western embargo against Russian oil if it's phased in gradually to cushion the economic shock, and that, of course, would develop one with natural gas as well. New numbers showing the Ukraine war's impacting Eurozone growth. GDP expanded just 0.2 of a percentage point in Q1. Eurozone inflation now is a record of 7.5%. And the war impacting corporate results. ExxonMobil taking a $3.5 billion charge for exiting Russia. Its shares are under pressure in the pre-market, down 1%. And Amazon and Apple too. Now, this is a point we'll be talking about throughout the morning. Amazon is losing nearly $4 billion in the first quarter, so it's worst, forgive me, sales growth in more than a decade. Apple is warning China's lockdown will hurt sales. To the latest, Claire Sebastian on this. There's much there we need to chew over. So let's do the financial bits first. Amazon and Apple. Amazon's numbers, why? What was the underlying direction for Amazon to lose this?
Yeah, Richard, so they are, on the one hand, chalking it up to an investment in electric car company Rivian. They say that they lost $7.6 billion due to the precipitous drop in that stock price since its IPO in November. But there's more to it than that. This is about big tech, including Amazon, which has benefited so greatly from the pandemic and the lockdowns, really sort of coming off those dizzy heights and showing that it's not immune to the same kind of supply chain and inflationary pressures that the rest of the economy is looking at as well. I thought what was really interesting about this is that they are saying that there are costs in there that they can control and costs in there that they can't. So the costs they can't are things like shipping costs, inflation, fuel, wage, sort of, labor shortages, things like that. But the ones they can control are the impacts of the immense growth they saw during the pandemic. They doubled their fulfillment network that they'd spent 25 years building. They doubled it in 24 months. They doubled their workforce from the first quarter of 2020 to this quarter. An extraordinary amount of growth, and they now say that they're coming off that and they have some excess capacity in their system, and that is costing them money because of lower productivity. So they are having to manage that going forward, Richard.
Let's talk on this oil and gas. Germany's ready to support a Western embargo. To a large extent, we're talking here about oil, not gas, because they need gas and will do until the end of the year. But it's interesting that they're basically saying they now only get 12% of oil from Russia.
Yeah, I think this is part of the story, Richard, that we haven't actually talked enough about. The countries, while this war has been going on, have actually already started the work that they need to do in reducing their dependency on Russia. That doesn't mean that they are ready for the taps to be switched off, but they say, well, certainly Thierry Breton, the EU Commissioner, said to this show yesterday that he is trying right now to put the work in for the EU that will mean that they can cope if the taps are switched off. But all eyes, of course, are on Germany when it comes to whether or not the EU will move to an oil embargo. They are the biggest importer of Russian oil and gas in Europe, the biggest economy. If they say they're ready to do this, I think that signals momentum.
Claire Sebastian in London. Claire, thank you. China now vowing to boost stimulus as COVID growth obviously hits, or COVID lockdown hitting growth. Beijing may be winding down its months-long crackdown on tech. The Asian markets rallied with the Hong Kong Hang Seng up 4%. Selena Wang's in Kunming for us. What's the indication, Selena, that they may be about to ease off the pressure on the tech companies?
Well, earlier today, Richard, we had this Politburo statement saying that they want to promote healthy growth of the internet sector and they want to boost this technology sector, which is a clear indication for many outside observers that regulators are now ready to ease up on that sweeping regulatory crackdown that started back in 2020. And what this is also clear, the statement from the Politburo about potentially easing these tech restrictions as well as boosting the economy, is that China's leaders are increasingly concerned about the grim economic outlook. Analysts are calling these COVID lockdowns across China, quote, making China's economy get closer to breaking point. Right now, there are at least 27 cities across China that are under some sort of lockdown. That is impacting around 180 million people. That's more than half the US population. And these comments from earlier today from the Politburo, Richard, come after just earlier this week, Xi Jinping said that the country needs to go on an all-out spending spree on infrastructure, to spend more on construction projects, on large-scale transportation transportation projects and in technology to try and boost the economy and boost consumer demand. And it's extremely critical that China try and turn the economy around this year. This is ahead of the very important Communist Party Congress this fall, in which Xi Jinping is widely expected to secure a historic third term as party chief.
All right, Selena, getting in and out of China at the moment, many business travellers just can't be bothered. It's far too difficult, even if you could get permission.
Exactly, Richard. I mean, even before these latest outbreaks, China was one of the hardest places to enter in the world. Foreign visas are extremely limited, and it's even much harder than that for American journalists to get into China because of US-China tensions. So finally, after I got approval, the big hurdle after that was just getting a flight into the country. The only flight our team could find for me from Tokyo was to Kunming, China, which is 1,600 miles away from Beijing, where I'm intended to be based. So this is the story of how I entered China during this zero COVID policy and increasing lockdowns. China is like entering a fortress. The country has been virtually sealed off since the start of the pandemic, guarded by strict border controls and the world's harshest quarantine. My journey to get in started with 3 PCR tests in Tokyo.
7 days out from my flight, just got my first COVID test.
Back at home, I track my daily temperature and pack a suitcase full of snacks to prepare for 21 days in quarantine. Within 48 hours of boarding, China requires PCR tests at 2 different government-approved clinics.
This is possibly the most paperwork I've ever needed to board an airplane.
I say goodbye to Tokyo, my home for the past 1.5 years. Checking in at the airport, relatively smooth.
Still checking my documents. Eva, I finally have my boarding pass. I'm at the gate. I'm going to China.
Most people on my flight are Chinese citizens. Foreigners can only enter under very limited conditions. It's even harder for American journalists because of US-China tensions. All the flight attendants in full protective gear.
Getting ready for takeoff. Here we go.
Flights into China, especially Beijing, are extremely limited. Even though I'll be based in the capital, first I'm flying to Yunnan province. After landing, I get another COVID test. A bus eventually takes us to the quarantine location. No one can choose where they'll be locked in for the next 21 days. Hours later, we arrive. I count myself lucky. It's a hot spring resort converted into a quarantine site. It's my first time here, but I'll have to enjoy the view from the window. I can't step out onto the balcony or open my door, except for health checkups and food pickup. 2 temperature checks a day, regular COVID tests, sometimes even twice a day. Food delivery isn't allowed, but breakfast, lunch, and dinner are part of the quarantine fees. These restrictions are all part of China's zero COVID policy. Across China, tens of millions are sealed inside their homes. Since mid-December, China's average new daily case count has surged from double digits to more than 20,000. Any positive case and close contact has to go to government quarantine. Entire metropolises brought to a standstill. Most of Shanghai's 25 million residents have been locked in for weeks, many struggling to get enough food and medical care. In year 3 of the pandemic, most of the world is learning to live with COVID, but in China, no case is tolerated, no matter the emotional and economic cost. I'm currently on day 7 of 21 days of quarantine, but even after these 21 days are up, it's not clear whether or not I can fly into Beijing. As Beijing tightens controls around the city, even though COVID cases are currently still low, if the situation worsens and it goes into a full lockdown, flights into Beijing will probably be canceled. But right now I still count myself lucky. Even though I can't choose what I eat, at least I get 3 meals a day, which is better than what a lot have been dealing with in Shanghai, where they're still struggling to procure enough daily essentials and food. Now, these 21 days in quarantine, the countless COVID tests, hoops to go through, Richard, it is no surprise that so many are just avoiding leaving the country or going in.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you've explained something. I was wondering why you were in Kunming, and I kept looking at notes thinking, have I missed that we've opened a bureau into Kunming? Now it all becomes clear. You're on day 7 of 21 days. Well, I wish you well in your endeavours there. We'll follow and we'll keep a track. Well, not as much as you'll keep track, but anyway, we will keep track of how you're doing. Selena, have a good weekend as best you can. Oh, and one other thing. Does that spa bath in that hotel, does that actually work, or has they switched it off?
Well, thank you so much for that, by the way. And let's see after 21 days if you still see me here in Kunming. The bath, I turned it on a few times and the water coming out is brown and muddy. So I'm just going to avoid using it at all cost.
Oh, well, that's disappointing. Thank you. Good to see you. Keep well. As we continue tonight, more on the conflict in Ukraine, which includes a war on the economic front. The president of the American Chamber of Commerce will be live to talk about the damage being done to Ukraine's economy and what that means globally. Also, an escalating humanitarian catastrophe. Doctors Without Borders on how it's getting help to those who need it most. There are fears that Russia is trying to expand the conflict beyond the borders of Ukraine. They're using tactics ranging from cutting off energy supplies to making nuclear threats. Estonia, for instance, shares a border with Russia and says it would gladly welcome the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO, strengthening its eastern flank. On New Day, a little earlier, speaking was the Estonia Prime Minister, who says Russia is trying to intimidate its neighbours, whatever means it can.
Russia wants NATO to be part of this because the big rhetoric has been that NATO is attacking Russia. It's a war between NATO and Russia, but it actually it's not. So what they are doing, they are threatening different countries and using the tools that they have. And they, of course, have a lot of tools in their toolbox. One is the dependency on gas and oil, so that, they are cutting off certain countries, not all, to give a message to everybody that we can do this to you as well. But I think it was President Roosevelt who said that the only thing we should be afraid is fear itself. So we shouldn't be intimidated by their actions.
Do you have any fear that Russia has intentions toward you at this point?
No, we see a lot of threats that they are making towards different countries. What Russia is really good at is playing on our fears and knowing exactly what each and every country or the population of that country is afraid of. So for some countries, it's nuclear, so they are bringing in this nuclear threat, whereas for some others it's invasion. So they are playing those different types of fears, but we should not fall into this.
Estonia's Prime Minister. American firms inside Ukraine overwhelmingly agree that when the war is over, they want to play their part in rebuilding the country. The American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine has been finding out the situation and how it is for its 600 or so members. Giant companies like Citibank, Coca-Cola and Visa, and for, of course, their people and employees on the ground. 76% say all their employees are safe. 72% say they're continuing to pay salaries, full salaries. About 40% are fully operational and 87% plan to actively participate in the post-war rebuilding. Joining me now is the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. It's Andy Hundo, who managed to leave the country, Andy, because you basically saw what was about to happen, and before or as it did, you got out.
Yes, Richard. I woke up on the 24th of February in Kiev, and with the air sirens blaring and the missiles hitting Kiev. So my son and I, we got into the car. We already had jerry cans in the car. We'd been driving around 3 weeks prior to the war because the US intelligence was telling us this is what is going to happen. We had paper maps. We had, because we thought the internet, the mobile networks would go down. We had cash, local currency, hard currency, and we drove west. Luckily, we have AmChams across Europe, and in this particular case, AmCham Slovakia took good care of us. And, what we have seen in the first 2 months, I think especially it's the amazing work that the internet companies, the mobile networks have done. Right. The internet has been up and the mobile network has been up uninterrupted, which is fascinating. So much effort has gone into that to keep that running. The banks are running. The banks managed to move data centers out of cities like Dnipro, across eastern Ukraine. They've managed to either take them up into the clouds or to Frankfurt out of the country. So it is, there's a lot of hard work still going on, and businesses are continuing. 40% of our members are continuing.
On that point, because one minister did point out to me that whilst the eastern part, I'm not for a second suggesting normality, whilst the eastern part may be under fire, etc., the western part, there is still productivity, there are still factories that are producing goods, and there are still services. And to that extent, some of your members, again, not normal, but are managing to do business as best they can.
Absolutely, Richard. We do see factories that are manufacturing Nespresso coffee machines or are doing electronic and electric wiring for the automobile sector. They are continuing. We've seen many factories that have been destroyed. In Trostanets, this is a big chocolate factory that makes Oreo cookies for all of Europe. That's been pretty much destroyed. We've seen a Unilever factory in Hostomel that's been destroyed. We've seen numerous McDonald's restaurants that have been destroyed. But there are still companies across in Kiev, in Western Ukraine, that are continuing. Many of the service companies, their business is totally dried up. They are hardly getting any customer related business. So what we're asking for the global business community is do business with Ukrainians, especially in the service sectors like advertising, consulting, information technologies, legal. Outsource your business to these people. Many of them are doing pro bono work. One law company that I spoke to yesterday, they are fully doing pro bono work. And one of the projects they just completed last week was the application of Ukraine to become an EU member, the application form. So a lot of pro bono work going on, but still it's really asking, the global business community to do business with Ukrainians.
Is there a sort of a difficulty here between continuing to do business and supporting Ukraine, but also being very well aware, of course, of the difficulties? I mean, it's how you help. You don't break sanctions against Russia, obviously, in doing so. You navigate this and you keep your staff safe at the same time. It's a tricky line to move.
Well, yes. I mean, we've said many times before, it is immoral. Not only is it immoral, but now it's also illegal to do business in Russia. President Biden on April 6th signed an executive order prohibiting all new investments in Russia by US citizens, no matter where they're located. So I think, we are asking, for these companies to continue doing business in Ukraine. Ukraine, obviously, the big sector is agriculture. That currently is pretty much at a standstill. The ports, we have 104 vessels that are stuck in the Black Sea. Nothing's coming in, nothing's coming out. And that is Russia really choking. It's holding Ukraine's economy by the throat. It is strangling it. And until that Black Sea reopens, until we get some minesweepers clearing up the mines and reopening those ports, the economy is just going to shrink and shrink. We're looking at about the World Bank saying a contraction of 45% GDP, but a lot of that depends on the ports, because there is some that's coming out of the wheat, the sunflower. Ukraine is #1 in the world for sunflower production and sunflower exports. It's big on wheat. Many nations across the globe are very much reliant on Ukrainian soft commodities, on wheat, on corn, on sunflower seeds. And until that sort of opens up, the sea is cleared, the ports are back operating, the vessels are coming in, going down through the Bosphorus and across the world. That is what really needs to happen as soon as possible. Otherwise, it's going to be a disaster for Ukraine's economy.
We'll talk more about this. Thank you, sir. This is CNN on a Friday. Welcome back. The mayor of Mariupol says more than 600 people have been injured in recent bombings at the Azovstal steel complex. Officials there say Russian forces blocked off a potential escape route only hours after the Ukrainian government said it would try again to get civilians from there. Heavy shelling is continuing in the eastern regions. Russia struck an important railway hub and a supply line for Ukrainian troops. And millions of Ukrainians have been displaced since the war started. One of them has been reunited with her family in Kiev. She's a 12-year-old girl who was taken to Russian-occupied territory after bombs killed her father in Mariupol. CNN's Matt Rivers has her story.
For Kira Obedinsky, her new iPad is everything. She's 12 after all, but the shiny screen is also a welcome distraction from an ordeal no 12-year-old should ever have to endure. Because just a few weeks ago, the young Ukrainian wasn't safe like she is now in Kyiv, but in a hospital run by Russian-backed separatists, forcibly separated from her family. When the Russians first invaded Mariupol, Kira's dad, Yevhen, was still alive. Her mom had died just after she was born. And when Russian bombs started to fall, they sheltered in a neighbor's basement, she recalls. But they hit the house where we were staying, she says. We were buried in the cellar. Then the rescuers took us out of the wreckage. Her dad did not emerge, Kira told us. Now an orphan, she started to walk to try and find safety amidst chaos. And then another explosion from a mine. My friend saw something on the ground, she says, and she hit it accidentally with her boot. The military came after the explosions and took us to a hospital because we were bleeding. But in some ways, her journey was just beginning. In the chaos, she was picked up by soldiers she says spoke Russian and eventually brought to a Russian-held area in Donetsk. I was taken there at night, she says. They took shrapnel out of me, out of my ear. I screamed and cried a lot. It was shortly after this happened that CNN first learned about and reported Kira's story because Russia paraded it on state TV. State propagandists showed images of Kira in a Donetsk hospital and said she was being treated well. Convinced she was being mistreated, her family went public with her story, and it worked. A deal between Russia and Ukraine allowed her grandfather to travel to Russia and bring her back to Kyiv, where she told us what Russian state TV did not. It's a bad hospital there. The food there is bad, the nurses scream at you, the bed is bent like this. There wasn't enough space for all of us inside. None of that came out on Russian state TV. Her injuries have largely healed now, though she'll stay in the hospital a little longer. It was there that someone gave her that iPad, after a presidential visit came bearing gifts this week. She didn't love all that attention, though, so for now, she says she just wants to see her cat and spend time with her grandfather, recovering from the horrors of war, one game at a time. Matt Rivers, CNN, Kyiv, Ukraine.
From displacement and injury to worse, Ukraine's civilians are bearing the brunt of this war. The UN says more than 2,800 people have died in the conflict and more have been injured. The numbers, of course, will probably be much higher when we finally find out. Doctors Without Borders is leaping into the fray, trying to help key medical supplies and sending a specially equipped medical train across the country in a bid to reach those in need. Avril Benoit is with me, the executive director of Doctors Without Borders. It is good to see you. Thank you for taking the time. So what is it that you need? We are very familiar, of course, with your organization. In the case of Ukraine, there is a health network, there is a health infrastructure, if you will, and in some places it was highly sophisticated. So where now do you fit in to bolster that which is there?
You're absolutely right. Not only do they have staff who are highly skilled, Ukraine was also a place that welcomed a lot of medical students from low-income countries, middle-income countries. The quality of care there is very high. And so what we have found in our discussions with doctors, nurses, people who are running the hospitals, especially in the war-affected areas in the east or places that are being bombed, is that they have a lot of concern about patients who require follow-up surgery, patients who require rehabilitation, that post-operative care that can take a long time. And they're worried that they're going to be overwhelmed by mass casualty influxes of patients, that they're going to not have enough time, attention, and also the calm necessary for people to really recover properly. So one of the areas where our help was requested is in medical referrals. So normally you would do this in an ambulance, but given the distances and the numbers, what we decided to do was outfit a train. It's got doctors and nurses on board, a certain standard of medical equipment, and if the patients are well enough to travel for up to 24 hours, so going from, say, a hospital in the east, we load them at the train station, we take a good number, up to 40 at a time, and we can transport them all the way across the country, 24 hours, if not more, with a lot of stops along the way. And over that time, we can monitor their vitals, make sure they're going to be okay, and then they get the follow-up care at the receiving end at a hospital in the West.
So this is extremely interesting initiative because the rest of the world is helping in every way it can. I noticed the number of the medical supplies that you've been able to bring in. So you're getting the goods. What's the challenge in with this train?
The challenge of the train right now, the main one, is that we don't have enough trains like this. There are so many patients requiring medical referrals. We wish we could do so much more. So we keep trying to keep it on the tracks. And of course, it's now becoming increasingly obvious that there's a risk of being on the rails. For the most part, the railway system is running well, moving all kinds of goods and people. The shipments of medical supplies, for example, coming in often are coming by rail. But for us, we have to be always vigilant and mindful of the fact that some tracks and stations are being attacked.
And your own staff, of course, and your own people, the safety of them is key in all of this. How long do you think you can keep this operation going?
We will do it as long as we can, Richard. It's imperative to be able to bring these people to safety so that they can get the excellent care that's available in those hospitals in the western parts of the country that are less affected by the war. So we will certainly do it as long as we can. Right. I mean, we're working with the Railway Authority to try to make it as safe as possible and make sure that the journeys are avoiding as much as possible the conflict.
And finally, I guess the awful part will be that if Russia continues, I say if, there seems to be no reason to doubt that they won't, continues to prosecute this war with the ferocity and gravity that they are, then if you could eventually become overwhelmed. The sheer number of casualties, God forbid, will overwhelm all potential medical supplies.
Yes, it's a huge concern that you've got not only trauma wounded who require very specialized care, but you also have all the people with other ailments, other medical conditions that are kind of being lost in the priority on trauma patients sometimes, you know, the people who just require medication for their chronic illness. So those are also the people that we're worried are going to be left behind as we see this war evolve and people are increasingly finding themselves in insecure places.
I'm grateful you've taken time this morning to talk to us. Thank you. This is CNN. More news in a moment. Gosh, welcome back. Stocks are up and running on the last trading day of April. Challenging day, left, right and centre. Wherever you look, the Nasdaq's off 1.25%. Amazon among the worst performing stocks after reporting a shocking quarterly loss of almost $4 billion. And Amazon is down 12%. Claire Sebastian is back. You told us earlier about the various reasons that Amazon had problems, but I always come back to this same point. At the end of the day, I will still order tonight at some point, or I'll order something from Amazon, and millions others will do the same. What justifies a reduction of 12%?
Well, Richard, it's not about the demand for Amazon's services, it's e-commerce or AWS, which actually really propped up this earnings report. This is about the costs the company is facing. Inflation, fuel, shipping. We talked about this. The fact that they grew so much during the pandemic and now have spare capacity. This isn't going to end with this quarter. That is the crucial thing to realize. That, I think, is why we're seeing this drop, not just a knee-jerk reaction, but a sort of repricing. It's something that we're seeing across the board, really, with tech, as we see them come off those growth rates that we saw last year and perhaps the year before as well. That's what's going on here. It's the fact that this is not just this quarter. It's not just a blip. The inflationary pressures they're seeing are going to carry on for a little bit. So that's what we're seeing here. And Tesla's price is up today. Elon Musk sold 4 billion or so of his stock. It was expected. I'm wondering that fall of 10% that we saw a couple of days ago, that was pricing in the fact he was going to have to sell. Yeah, absolutely, Richard. And Tesla, I think you have to look look out a bit longer term with that stock. Yes, it's been off a bit since he announced his stake in Twitter, but down 25% year to date, up 32% over the last 12 months. But since its low of March 2020, Tesla is up some 950%. So that is the big picture here. I think these recent falls are just a sort of reaction to the fact that he has to sell his company's stock to pay for Twitter. Also, the concerns that he might be distracted from the running of Tesla when he buys Twitter. But I think overall, this company is still looking pretty strong. It's the market leader. I'm just trying to see quickly the Twitter price. It is slightly up today, just a dollar, a couple of cents. It's up 49.13. It's 49.24 on the screen. The market, the arbitrage is still there between the spot and the offer price. Yeah, Richard, I think you can see why the board went ahead and accepted this now, because it's not making it back up to what Elon Musk offered. And again, they didn't get any better offers between the time at which they introduced that poison pill and the time at which they accepted his offer. So look. Claire, at this price, does he pay the breakup fee for the deal, the $1 billion breakup fee, or does he continue and get it when the market price is less? I'm sort of nervous to predict what Elon Musk is going to do next. He is notoriously unpredictable, but he's still tweeting about Twitter. He's still looking like he's making plans for this company. So I'd say for now, the money is on him going ahead with this. Thank you, Claire Sebastian. And of course, Quest Means Business bought one share of Twitter. We paid $48 for our one share, and we're going to follow it closely and arbitrage the difference. If we do get the $6 difference, we'll give it to charity. Thank you, Claire Sebastian. Coming up after the break, Singapore fights back for a slice of the global tourism market, and China's lockdown stands in the way of it.
As the Asian travel market is looking to get back on its feet, the lockdowns in China are now putting all that at some risk. China is Singapore's #1 source of tourist income. It's around $3 billion before the pandemic. Singapore reopened to vaccinated travellers at the beginning of the month after keeping the shutters down for more than 2 years. On Quest Means Business, I spoke to Keith Tan, the Chief Executive of Singapore's Tourism Board.
At least for our projections and our thinking for this year, we are not counting on recovery from China. And hence, we have to maximize getting tourists and visitors from other parts of the world, which is why I'm now here in the US.
Right, you're trying to drum up, and not unreasonably so. I have to say, though, of course, you've got stiff competition from every other part of the world that's doing something similar. So what have you got to offer? How are you reforming, if you will, the product and offering from Singapore?
Yeah. Well, I'm very confident that what we have and what we have built, even over the last 2 years, will be very relevant to visitors who are now looking for new experiences of renewal, experiences of coming back together to meet and reunite with old friends. Over the last 2 years, we have seen a tremendous explosion of new experiences, new offerings, new products in Singapore, because the tourism attractions and hotels in Singapore have had to adapt to meet domestic demands, domestic requirements. And in the process of innovating, they've created a whole new universe of new products and experiences that I believe are very relevant for visitors coming now into Singapore from around the region and from the US and other parts of the world. For example, a strong emphasis on renewal and well-being. We've created a whole, I observe a lot more emphasis and interest in these experiences, to the extent that now we are curating a wellness festival in Singapore in June to make all these products and offerings much more knowable and discoverable.
Singapore's a long way in some cases, but finally, wreckage found on Mars even further. It's not an alien spaceship, rather debris from the Perseverance rover, captured on camera by NASA's Mars helicopter Ingenuity. The chopper took photos of the parachute that helped its rover Perseverance land on the red planet, as well as the shell that protected the rover's landing capsule. Perseverance journey was no small feat. Getting to Mars means surviving extreme gravitational forces and temperatures, all at the speed of more than 12,000 miles per hour. That's you up to date. Connect the World is next. I'll be back in a couple of hours with One World.
the morning, said Luda. They didn't let us out. We're shields for them. They don't let us out, and by foot and by bicycle we go. In the fields we ran.
With Russian forces just across the river, the residents of this Ukrainian town are bracing for an imminent attack. And
I was taken there at night, she says. They took shrapnel out of me, out of my ear. I screamed and cried a lot.
the story of this 12-year-old shows that Russian propaganda is not ashamed of using children to promote their message. Plus,
in Warsaw alone, the mayor's office estimates the city has taken in more than 100,000 children, with 17,000 already enrolled in public school.
for young Ukrainian refugees, this is a slice of normality. The question now is how many more will come? We go back to school in Poland. I'm Eleni Jarkas in Dubai. Hello and welcome to Connect the World. Let's begin in Mariupol, where we're learning that 600 people have been wounded in the heaviest Russian airstrikes to hit the Azovstal steel plant so far. The city's mayor says the bombing hit a makeshift hospital within the complex on Wednesday. It comes as Ukraine announces another attempt to rescue those still trapped inside the factory. But a Mariupol official says Russia is thwarting those efforts. In his daily address Thursday, President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned Moscow's relentless shelling of the besieged city.
Moscow claimed they had allegedly ceased fire in Mariupol, but the bombing of the defenders of the city continues. This is a war crime committed by the Russian military, literally in front of the whole world. Russia's shelling of Mariupol did not stop, even when the UN Secretary General was holding negotiations in Moscow.
Mr. Zelensky is also accusing Russia of launching a missile attack on the capital on Thursday, while UN Chief Antonio Guterres was wrapping up his visit there. Officials say the strikes hit residential buildings in Kyiv, wounding several people. And according to the US and NATO, Russian troops are making slow and uneven progress in their ruthless assault on eastern Ukraine, but they're learning from mistakes made during the early days of the war. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian military reports heavy shelling in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The General Staff of the Armed Forces is accusing Russian troops of robbing one village of over 60 tons of wheat. Also in eastern Ukraine, this railway hub in the Donetsk region was hit by heavy shelling on Thursday. It serves as a crucial supply line for Ukrainian troops in the east. Now, just how much progress is Russia making in the Donbass? CNN's John Berman posed that question to Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby a bit earlier. Take a listen.
What we're seeing here, John, is incremental progress by the Russians, particularly as they move south through the Donbass, coming from that northern area where they came in after they had to evacuate Kyiv. It's incremental and it's slow because they might take a little bit of ground. The Ukrainians will take it back, and so they have not been exactly on their schedule. They are trying very hard, John, to overcome the challenges they had in the north by making sure logistics and sustainment can keep up with the movement of troops. But the Ukrainians are fighting back hard and making it hard for them to make any progress. They're also wary of running too far ahead of their supply lines, so they're going rather slowly. The last thing I'd say is, just like we said it would, this particular fight is heavily reliant on what we call long-range fires, artillery. And so you're seeing that the Russians are shelling well in advance of their troop movements, but they're not able to, they have not been able to sufficiently weaken the Ukrainian defenses with that shelling. The Ukrainians are able to fight right back.
Well, that was Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby talking to CNN there. Now, the reality of what's happening in this war isn't apparent to many inside of Russia. Case in point, the story of a 12-year-old girl taken from her family and used to promote Russian propaganda. Now, as Matt Rivers tells us, the truth of her story is very different than what we saw on state-run Russian television.
For Kira Obedinsky, her new iPad is everything. She's 12 after all, but the shiny screen is also a welcome distraction from an ordeal no 12-year-old should ever have to endure. Because just a few weeks ago, the young Ukrainian wasn't safe like she is now in Kyiv, but in a hospital run by Russian-backed separatists, forcibly separated from her family. When the Russians first invaded Mariupol, Kira's dad, Yevhen, was still alive. Her mom had died just after she was born, and when Russian bombs started to fall, they sheltered in a neighbor's basement, she recalls. But they hit the house where we were staying, she says. We were buried in the cellar. Then the rescuers took us out of the wreckage. Her dad did not emerge, Kira told us. Now an orphan, she started to walk to try and find safety amidst chaos. And then another explosion from a mine. My friend saw something on the ground, she says, and she hit it accidentally with her boot. The military came after the explosions and took us to a hospital because we were bleeding. But in some ways, her journey was just beginning. In the chaos, she was picked up by soldiers she says spoke Russian and eventually brought to a Russian-held area in Donetsk. I was taken there at night, she says. They took shrapnel out of me, out of my ear. I screamed and cried a lot. It was shortly after this happened that CNN first learned about and reported Kira's story because Russia paraded it on state TV. State propagandists showed images of Kira in a Donetsk hospital and said she was being treated well. Convinced she was being mistreated, her family went public with her story, and it worked. A deal between Russia and Ukraine allowed her grandfather to travel to Russia and bring her back to Kyiv, where she told us what Russian state TV did not. It's a bad hospital there. The food there is bad, the nurses scream at you, the bed is bent like this. There wasn't enough space for all of us inside. None of that came out on Russian state TV. Her injuries have largely healed now, though she'll stay in the hospital a little longer. It was there that someone gave her that iPad, after a presidential visit came bearing gifts this week. She didn't love all that attention, though, so for now, she says she just wants to see her cat and spend time with her grandfather, recovering from the horrors of war, one game at a time. Matt Rivers, CNN, Kyiv, Ukraine.
All right, a very heartbreaking story that we've seen there. I want to now take you to the southern Ukrainian town. We've got Nick Payton-Walsh standing by for us to give us an update. Nick, great to have you on. You're in Kryvyi Rih right now. I want you to give me a sense of the news that we're hearing that there might be an imminent attack in your region.
Well, there have been concerns building over the past days that Kryvyi Rih, the hometown of President Volodymyr Zelensky, might be the next target of this increased Russian southern offensive. Coming up from Kherson, the city that they first occupied at the start of the war, pushing up the left bank of the Dnieper River towards forces in the east, already making, it seems, minor gains in that area. Here's what we saw on the ground yesterday.
If Moscow had any surprises left in this war, it is along here. The other side of the river has been Russia's for weeks, but here, the western side is caught in the fast-changing landscape of this week's push.
That's the prize over there, the Dnieper River, up past which, on the left side bank here, the Russians are trying to push, wanting control of both sides of that vital part of Ukraine. Here in Novovoronskovo, we are told there are a handful of Russian tanks just over a kilometre away on its outskirts, pushing, probing, but ultimately kept at bay by Ukrainian forces that still hold the town. Brazilians here, embodied in Ludmila, under the threat of rocket fire, planting onions. I'm here until victory, she said.
Mama сейчас и я. Дети выехали.
Понятно. Her children have gone. It's just her and her mother. Сколько лет ваша мама?
80.
Okay, her 80-year-old mother and her are staying here.
Мама сказала, никуда не уеду, а я ее не брошу.
Her mother says she's not going anywhere and she's not going to leave her alone.
У меня окна целые пока, да.
All her windows are blown out, she says. Ukrainian forces who don't want their positions filmed are dotted around the town, as too are the signs of innocent lives lost here. Rockets peeking out from under the water. And this boat in which 14 civilians tried to flee Russian occupation on April the 7th, 4 of them died when Moscow's troops opened fire when it was 70 meters out. Yet still, the desperate keep fleeing. This morning, these women left behind their men to defend their homes near Novоворonsovka. We ran early in the morning, said Luda. They didn't let us out. We're shields for them. They don't let us out, and by foot and by bicycle we go. In the fields we ran. Our soldiers were 2 kilometers away, Nadezhda adds, and we ran to them. What they need, the Russians take, she said. Take cars. They draw Zs on everything. As their new unwanted guests demanded milk and food at gunpoint, they had a glimpse of their warped mindset. They say they've come to liberate us, Luda said. These aggressors, that's what they told us. They say America is fighting here, but using the hands of Ukrainians to do it. That's what they say. Another claim to be fueled by the violence of the long war with separatists in the east. In general, the Donetsk militants say, she said, you have been bombing us for 8 years. Now we bomb you. Across the fields, loathing and artillery swallow whole once happy worlds.
Now, the offensive in the south of where I'm standing, clearly it does seem to be seeing some slight signs of Russian progress, but at the same time too there are Ukrainian villages being taken back by Ukrainian forces, and so it is certainly a mixed picture. But what is totally clear on 2 fronts is that Russia is making a significant effort to move up that side of the Dnieper River. It wants control of both banks of that strategic water flow, but at the same time too is, it seems, trying to push up towards where I'm standing as well, but facing perhaps more difficulties than it would like to have advertised. But what is important when we see today the extent of hopes for humanitarian evacuations out of Mariupol, far to the east of where I'm standing, but still in Ukraine's south, that this southern front has become the one that possibly is more telling in exactly how this war is going to progress, Elaine.
Nick, thank you so very much for that update. Great to have you on. We're now following breaking news from Afghanistan. An explosion at a mosque in Kabul has left at least 5 people dead and 20 injured. But witnesses are saying the death toll is likely much higher. It's the latest such attack in Afghanistan over the past 2 weeks. Most have targeted the Hazara Shia community, with an ISIS affiliate claiming responsibility. Now, it's not clear who was behind today's blast. We will be keeping an eye on this developing story. And just ahead on the show, people in Shanghai, China, under one of the strictest COVID lockdowns on earth, make their voices heard. We'll tell you about their Banging Your Pots protest. And we follow CNN correspondent Selena Wang as she moves from Tokyo to China and endures the world's harshest quarantine. Perhaps a light at the end of the tunnel for many in Shanghai, hard hit by COVID lockdown. City health officials say more than 12 million people in Shanghai live in low-risk areas and can now leave their homes. That's twice as many as 9 days ago. That's super loud. Well, that's the sound of banging pots as people protest from their balconies over a shortage of daily supplies and the city's month-long lockdown. Officials say almost all of the more than 15,000 new cases across China on Thursday were reported in Shanghai. 52 people died from COVID on Thursday. Still, China is defending its zero COVID strategy as, quote, a magic weapon. Selena Wang is in Kunming in southwestern China. Incredible to see those images generally since we've seen the COVID outbreak in various parts of China and the aggressive approach. Many still questioning whether the zero COVID policy is the right one.
Yeah, Elena, in year 3, China is still using these lockdowns, mass testing, strict border controls. In fact, China is one of the hardest countries to enter in the world. Visas are hard to come by and so are flights. In fact, I just traveled into the country last week and the only flight our team could find for me from Tokyo was to Kunming, China, which is 1,600 miles from Beijing, where I'm supposed to be based. So this is what my journey was like. Traveling into China is like entering a fortress. The country has been virtually sealed off since the start of the pandemic, guarded by strict border controls and the world's harshest quarantine. My journey to get in started with 3 PCR tests in Tokyo.
7 days out from my flight, just got my first COVID test.
Back at home, I track my daily temperature and pack a suitcase full of snacks to prepare for 21 days in quarantine. Within 48 hours of boarding, China requires PCR tests at 2 different government-approved clinics.
This is possibly the most paperwork I've ever needed to board an airplane.
I say goodbye to Tokyo, my home for the past 1.5 years. Checking in at the airport, relatively smooth.
Still checking my documents. I finally have my boarding pass. I'm at the gate. I'm going to China.
Most people on my flight are Chinese citizens. Foreigners can only enter under very limited conditions. It's even harder for American journalists because of U.S.-China tensions. All the flight attendants in full protective gear.
Getting ready for takeoff. Here we go.
Flights into China, especially Beijing, are extremely limited. Even though I'll be based in the capital, first I'm flying to Yunnan province. After landing, I get another COVID test. A bus eventually takes us to the quarantine location. No one can choose where they'll be locked in for the next 21 days. Hours later, we arrive. I count myself lucky. It's a hot spring resort converted into a quarantine site. It's my first time here, but I'll have to enjoy the view from the window. I can't step out onto the balcony or open my door, except for health checkups and food pickup. 2 temperature checks a day, regular COVID tests, sometimes even twice a day. Food delivery isn't allowed, but breakfast, lunch, and dinner are part of the quarantine fees. These restrictions are all part of China's zero COVID policy. Across China, tens of millions are sealed inside their homes. Since mid-December, China's average new daily case count has surged from double digits to more than 20,000. Any positive case and close contact has to go to government quarantine. Entire metropolises brought to a standstill. Most of Shanghai's 25 million residents have been locked in for weeks, many struggling to get enough food and medical care. In year 3 of the pandemic, most of the world is learning to live with COVID, but in China, no case is tolerated, no matter the emotional and economic cost. I'm currently on day 7 of 21 days of quarantine, but even after I finish these 21 days, it's unclear if I'll be able to get into Beijing. Right now, cases in Beijing are still relatively low, but if this partial lockdown goes into a full citywide one, flights will likely be canceled. Eleni?
Selena, I can't imagine the anxiety. I mean, I have to say that I think we've all been stuck somewhere during the pandemic. It is really illuminating to see your experience, because it's basically a litmus sort of test of what everyone else might be going through, but more aggressively so. Is there a sense by the government right now, because of the very vocal issues that people have been experiencing, that they might start easing the way that they view this latest outbreak?
Well, actually, in the most recent government announcements, we are hearing the Eleni double down on zero COVID. It's clear that in their messaging, they believe that without this policy, they think that China's death numbers and case numbers could explode, and it could completely overwhelm the healthcare system. There is also a political element of this as well. Some analysts say that this is putting politics over science. Xi Jinping, he's put his personal stamp on this policy, and it has become a critical part as well of the propaganda machine to prove that look at how low the death rates are here in China. This shows that our system is superior to America's and other Western countries. Right now, Beijing, they're in this partial lockdown, and they are mass testing as well. They're shutting many areas down, and the big question for residents there is, could this turn worse? Eleni?
Yeah. Selena, good luck and stay safe. Thank you so much. Shanghai has been under strict COVID lockdown for weeks, and it could come to a heavy economic cost. CNN's Christy Lou Stout explains.
It's China's biggest and most affluent city, and the streets have been empty for weeks. Shanghai is battling its worst ever COVID-19 outbreak, determined to crush it with its zero COVID policy. It comes at a steep cost to its economy and has implications for the world.
We're forecasting that the lockdown in Shanghai will rock China's economy. Shanghai is an economic powerhouse for China. It holds one of the 2 stock exchanges. Shanghai's port counts for something like 3% of global car fare throughput at any given time.
Shanghai is home to the world's busiest container port. It remains operational, but according to logistics platform Project 44, on April 18th, some ships have been diverted away due to truck shortages, but the containers are piling up at the port, waiting on average for 12 days before they are picked up and delivered, compared to just over 4 days in late March. Shanghai is also a major aviation hub, but the outbreak has forced the suspension of many flights, causing air freight rates to skyrocket. All of this is putting even more pressure on global supply chains.
This is having a supply shock. A lot of these shipments now can't leave the ports, can't leave the airport in Shanghai, and these are goods which are ultimately going to Europe and the US. It's going to push prices up. We're going to see more inflationary pressure.
The zero COVID strategy has also forced many factories in Shanghai to suspend operations. The Apple supplier Pegatron has suspended production at its Shanghai plant, and Volkswagen and Tesla's factories have been shut for weeks. Production has resumed at Tesla, with CEO Elon Musk saying this: Tesla Shanghai is coming back with a vengeance. But the company warned it too is not immune from supply chain problems.
Authorities in Shanghai are trying to get essential production plants open under what they call a closed loop system. That means that their staff actually sleep on the premises, on the factory floors, eat there, don't leave them, don't go home. But the problem is there's a lot of staff who don't want to do that, and there's a shortage of parts to get these factories reopened. So it's going to be a global problem.
Analyst Yan Zhenghuang warns that the economic pain caused by the zero COVID strategy could spiral out of control, saying this, quote, implementing the strategy in an excessive manner by itself could lead to disruption on the supply chain, mass unemployment, and then could translate into social, political instability, exactly what the zero COVID strategy wants to avoid, unquote. And yet Shanghai's weeks-long lockdown still has no end in sight. The bottom line from China watchers to the world: brace yourselves for the fallout. Christy Lou Stout, CNN, Hong Kong.
Let's get you up to speed now on some other stories that are on our radar. And several dozen people were injured in a confrontation between Palestinians and Israeli police at a key holy site in Jerusalem. It happened earlier today, the last Friday of Ramadan, at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Tensions at the site have been heightened during Ramadan, with clashes every Friday. Turkey's president is in Saudi Arabia. It is his first visit to the country since the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is trying to mend ties with Saudi Arabia amid economic challenges in his own country. Mr. Erdogan took part in an official ceremony at the palace before meeting one-on-one with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. UNICEF is urging residents of a province in the northwestern area of the Democratic Republic of Congo to maintain vigilance. The second person who died in a local Ebola outbreak was believed to have been in extensive contact with a large number of people. And still to come, mighty Russian tanks with an Achilles heel. How Ukraine found the fatal flaw and took deadly advantage. And a determination to make things work as Poland's public school system makes room for refugee children from Ukraine. Welcome back. I'm Eleni Jokos in Dubai and you're watching Connect the World. The number of Ukrainians reported injured inside the besieged steel plant in Mariupol is climbing. The mayor now says more than 600 people were wounded at a field hospital there. And that's after Russia launched an intense bombing attack Wednesday. He added that the Russians are jailing and torturing government workers who try to evacuate the city, although CNN hasn't been able to verify those claims. President Zelensky's office has said an operation to get civilians out of the plant is planned for Friday, although the details are still unclear. Meantime, Ukrainian officials say their forces have retaken a town near Kharkiv, while Russian forces have been shelling a critical rail hub that's been supplying Ukrainian troops in the east. US and NATO officials acknowledge Russian forces are making incremental progress in the east, but a senior US defense official says overall Russia's military progress in the Donbas region has been slow and uneven. CNN's Aaron Lieberman reports saying that there are more signs that Putin's invasion isn't going to plan.
Near the city of Kyiv, a Russian tank flaw laid bare, the turret separated from the body of the tank. A problem seen in other destroyed tanks as well. It's a design flaw in Russian tanks that Ukrainian forces have exploited.
If the turret is penetrated, and all our weapons penetrate the Russian turrets without problem, particularly the Javelin from top, where armor's thinnest, but that exposed ammunition will cook off immediately. It will go high order, and the whole exposed ammunition program inside the turret will blow.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has revealed to the US and the world many problems within one of the world's largest militaries. The Kremlin has tried to hide its losses from its own people, but Ukraine's messaging since the war began has cranked out videos of Russian armor being destroyed. The UK estimates Russia has lost as many as 580 tanks since fighting began.
The Russians have significant mechanized capability, but as you look at the techniques and tactics, procedures that they used, they were not very effective. And so you question the training, the leadership at the non-commissioned level, non-commissioned officer level, and their ability to provide basic logistics to a force that size.
Russian forces are now focusing on the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine, where a senior U.S. defense official says they have made some progress. They're trying to fix many of the problems that plagued the early invasion, using their advantage in firepower and trying to coordinate air and ground attacks. But officials say they don't appear to have learned those lessons yet. The performance of Vladimir Putin's military has surprised the U.S.
We did not do as well in terms of predicting the military challenges that he has encountered with his own military.
With the war now in its third month, no one's talking anymore about this ending quickly. Russia's attempting to regroup with a new goal in mind in southeast Ukraine. With U.S. and Western support, Ukraine is bracing for a long, brutal fight that the Biden administration has framed as much bigger than about one country.
A senior defense official says the Russian forces are trying to learn from the mistakes they made early on in the invasion, mistakes we saw carried out multiple times around Kyiv, but they have yet to determine if they'll be able to do so. They're still seeing some of the same logistics and sustainment problems, and one of the key issues that will be very hard to fix is the morale issues. A senior defense official says the Russian conscripts come in very amped up for the fight. They have been, quote, feasting on Russian propaganda, only to find out that the battle on the ground in Ukraine is going very differently. Oren Lieberman, CNN at the Pentagon.
Many of those who fled Ukraine are children, and that's putting a strain on Poland's public school system. CNN's Erika Hill has a story of one school in the Polish capital that's struggling to find space for the new students.
New school, new language, new country.
We follow the needs. When we opened these classes, we did not know what would be in a week, what would be in a month.
There are now 50 Ukrainian refugees enrolled at this Warsaw high school, bringing the student population up to 700. It's Olena's first day. Laisha is a few weeks in and happy to be back in class.
It's given me some space, or give me the feeling of safety, that I'm safe here, I'm in my normal life.
In Warsaw alone, the mayor's office estimates the city has taken in more than 100,000 children, with 17,000 already enrolled in public school. The question now is, how many more will come?
It's a big problem for us because we don't know how many students go to Warsaw and go to our schools.
Warsaw was already short 2,000 teachers before Russia invaded Ukraine. The city needs more staff and money.
This is a huge challenge for us. A good heart, willingness to help, and volunteering are not enough.
And yet, they're finding ways to make it work. Polish students are paired with their new Ukrainian classmates.
We use a lot of Google Translate.
Local families have donated supplies. The school provides breakfast and lunch. In Lviv, Mariana taught German. Officially, she's now a tutor, yet it's clear this mom of 3, who also fled the war, is so much more.
І ми один одного дуже розуміємо.
We don't just speak Ukrainian. We speak the language of emotions and the language of what we've gone through.
Comfort amidst the uncertainty.
Is it good to meet other Ukrainian kids?
Yes, because you're not alone.
While there are more smiles every day, the principal says he can't forget what lies beneath.
We have some who escaped in the middle of the night in their pajamas from the basement where they were.
While school is a welcome distraction, it's also a reminder of how much their lives have changed.
Ми душею хочемо почати новий навчальний рік.
In our hearts, we want to start the new school year in September at home, and we really hope for that.
Erica Hill, CNN, Warsaw.
And still ahead, the golf world is buzzing, and that's after Tiger Woods is spotted practicing. And we'll tell you where he was and why it's fueling speculation he's getting ready to compete again. On Mission Ahead, we introduced you to innovators who are taking on big, bold missions in science. Today, we're looking at robotics in a field of technology that's advancing by the day, sometimes in ways that you might not expect. CNN's Rachel Crane discovers a new kind of robot unlike any you've seen before.
Building the next big thing in tech can take time.
Sometimes innovation should not be too fast.
In this case, it's moving at a snail's pace. Meet Li Jiang, engineer, professor, and now maker of sludge-like goo.
It behaves sometimes like a liquid, sometimes like a solid.
Inspired by the cheap slime toy that children play with all over the world, Jiang's team first created the substance in 2021 by mixing a simple polymer with borax. The magic happened when they added magnetic particles.
Then basically you get this so-called magnetic slime bot.
So when it comes close to a magnet, it can move, change shape, and grasp objects. Zhang is one of a growing number of scientists worldwide on a mission to better understand a relatively new field in tech, soft robotics.
Traditionally, when people think about robotics, they think about big robot arms in factories that are very strong, very fast, and very precise. In the field of soft robotics, we're thinking about how do you make robots that are more flexible, more adaptable.
Sometimes looking to nature helps, like the agile but entirely boneless octopus. In 2016, Harvard unveiled this silicone proof of concept called the Octobot. Hydrogen peroxide inside the robot is converted into a gas, which moves its arms. Others are working on soft robotics that mimic human limbs, or even augment them. While Zhang is testing how his robot could work inside the human body. For instance, a patient who accidentally ingested a foreign object. Zhang's idea? Rather than performing surgery, the doctor asked the patient to swallow the robot. Directed by a magnet, the robot would locate the object, such as a battery, nail, or coin like this one, cushioning sharp edges and stopping any harmful chemical leaks. Nature would eventually take its course for both. So far, the process is still hit and miss, and it's years from approval, according to Zhang. Experts say that this kind of research may ultimately have a much wider influence in the world of robotics.
Completely soft robots don't make much sense. I think that now that we have learned that compliance is helpful, softness is helpful, we cannot build robots without any compliant part.
But like any big mission to develop new technology, this one will take time.
Take two, Tiger. It could be happening. Tiger Woods was spotted playing a practice round Thursday at the site of golf's second major championship of the season, and that's after returning to competitive action earlier this month at the Masters. World Sports' Alex Thomas is here with more on this intriguing development for golf fans. Should we be reading into this, would you say, Alex?
Not necessarily, but we're going to anyway, just because he's such a megastar, isn't he? And we really thought we might have seen the end of him on a competitive golf course, full stop, after that horrific crash he had last year. You know, we now know in hindsight that he almost lost his leg. He battled back. Golf may look like an easy sport compared to some others, but it's pretty grueling when you have to walk around 72 holes. His practice round at Southern Hills suggests he will play in the PGA next month. He's already committed to the Open here in the UK at St Andrews in July.
Interesting times. Okay, Alex, we're going to a short break and you'll be back with more sports right after this. Stay with us.
Hello, welcome to CNN World Sport. I'm Alex Thomas in London. Only one spot remains in the next stage of the NBA playoffs after the Suns, Mavericks and 76ers all clinched series wins to reach the conference semi-finals. Andy Scholes is at CNN Center for us with all the details. Andy, it was the performance of veteran Chris Paul that really caught our eye on Thursday night.
Oh, Alex, I mean, this was just incredible. You know, Chris Paul, he's 36 years old. This is his 17th NBA season, but this may have been the best playoff performance of his entire career. He was perfect on Thursday night, and I mean that literally. CP3, 14 for 14 shooting. That was the most field goals without a miss in a playoff game in NBA history. He led Phoenix with 33 points as they came back in the fourth quarter to eliminate the Pelicans in 6 games. Now, CP3 very close with Pelicans coach Willie Green. They played together, remained great friends. They shared a nice embrace after the series was all over, as did Green and his former boss, Suns coach Monty Williams. Now, Paul did not miss a shot in the game, as I mentioned. His teammate Devin Booker, who returned from injury Thursday night, said Paul should have taken a heat check, which is making sure you shoot until you miss.
We was talking about taking heat checks the other day, and I don't do that because I don't shoot enough to take a heat check, and once I miss, I might be cold, you know, but they would sort of let me get to my spot.
I believe in the heat check, though. 14 for 15 looks a lot better than 14 to 14 to me.
He gonna heat check even if he ain't hit 5 in a row.
I'll never have one of these games, these perfect ones.
Yeah, so the Suns all smiles as they move on. Jazz All-Star center Rudy Gobert, he's not smiling on Thursday because he had a swollen face. That's because he got stung by bees from his own beehive, but he still played, though, as Utah had to win to stay alive in Game 6 against the Mavs. This game really good late. Jalen Brunson coming up huge again, makes the 3 here with 2 minutes to go to give the Mavs the lead. Final seconds, Utah had a chance to win it, but Bojan Bogdanovic shot no good. That's how the Jazz season ends. Mavs win 98-96. Luka Doncic on to the second round for the first time in his career. Dallas getting a series win for the first time since winning it all back in 2011. They're going to play the Suns in round 2 starting on Monday. And the third time was the charm for the 76ers. They were finally able to close out the Raptors in Game 6 after being up 3-0 in this series. Joel Embiid battling through that torn ligament in his thumb, but still just dominant. Scored a game-high 33 points. Philly sealing the deal in the third quarter with a huge 22-3 run. They won big, 132-97. They're going to face the Heat starting on Monday. One series is going to start this weekend for sure. That's the Bucks and the Celtics. They'll square off in Game 1 on Sunday. The last first-round series, Alex, still not decided. Game 6 Friday night between Memphis and Minnesota. I tell you what, you know, the Warriors would certainly love for that series to go 7 as they lay back and watch these games right now from their couch.
Absolutely. Superb roundup as always. Andy Scholes at CNN Center. Thanks, Andy. Now, without saying a word, Tiger Woods has dropped the biggest hint yet that he will play at next month's PGA Championship. He's been filmed practicing at Southern Hills in Oklahoma, the venue for the second major of the men's golf season, and he was looking strong despite ongoing rehabilitation after the horrific leg injury sustained in a car crash last year. Tiger's first event since that accident was the Masters earlier this month, and he's also committed to playing in the 150th Open Championship at St Andrews in July. Okay, we'll find out who the Women's Champions League finalists will be this weekend, and Ada Hegerberg has been telling us ahead of that why the thirst for women's football is brilliant. Hello again, World Sports back with the Women's Champions League semi-finals. Barcelona leading Wolfsburg 5-1 and Lyon 3-2 up against Paris Saint-Germain. The second legs are on Saturday in Wolfsburg and Paris respectively. Both those games total sellouts. Arguably a dream final for the neutral would be Barcelona against Lyon. Barca succeeding their French rivals as the dominant team in the women's game right now. Lyon's challenge this season helped by the return to form and fitness of former Ballon d'Or winner Ada Hegerberg. She's the all-time leading scorer in the Women's Champions League. She's won the competition 5 times. She's also back in the Norway national side and has been speaking to our own Christina McFarlane about this weekend's clash with PSG.
That game on Saturday in Paris is going to be a very tough game. It's going to be a big challenge. We're only halfway. Obviously, we were very happy to get away with a win at home in front of a fantastic crowd. I know there's a lot of tickets being sold for that game in Paris as well. So, I mean, those are the games you want to play as well. Those you train for every year, all year long. And it's going to be a tough one.
And if you do qualify, how do you assess Lyon's chances of lifting an 8th Champions League trophy this season, especially potentially against a side like Barcelona, who are becoming a real powerhouse in women's football and, of course, looking for their first back-to-back win this year?
Yeah, obviously, Barcelona is a very strong team. You can see that they have gotten time to develop their style of game together. They play a very strong possession-oriented football as well. But it's very hard to talk about the final yet. I think it's very important to kind of like stay in the moment. We haven't reached the final yet. It's going to be a very tough last stretch in order to do it.
Just briefly, while mentioning Barcelona, we have to also reflect that this has been a historic month for women's football. We saw the Camp Nou sell out not once but twice this month for the Clásico and also in the Champions League as well. What did you feel when you saw those stands packed full with over 90,000 fans?
It's brilliant. That's what we try to achieve every women's club. That we've seen some good trends, and now the big challenge is obviously to get those people get back to the stadiums week in and week out and get that stability that we need, because obviously it looks like people are thirsting for football, for women's football as well.
Here in England, Chelsea have pulled ahead of Arsenal in the race for the Women's Super League title. Chelsea, the reigning champions, facing Tottenham on Thursday night. Bethany England putting them ahead midway through the first half. And this is how she did it. Keris Harrop then equalising for Spurs just before the break. And that was the first of 2 goals in just 3 minutes, with Aussie star Sam Kerr claiming her 18th of the season in first half stoppage time. Chelsea then winning 2-1 to go 4 points clear of Arsenal, who play their game in hand against Aston Villa on Sunday. It's only fun being a Liverpool fan right now. Mo Salah's just been named Player of the Year by the Football Writers Association. They're still in the hunt for a quadruple of major trophies. And now Jurgen Klopp has signed a contract extension. The Germans enjoyed a special relationship with the Anfield faithful almost from the moment he arrived back in 2015. He's the longest-serving Premier League manager at the moment. Klopp's new deal keeps him at Liverpool until at least 2026. That's 2 years more than the contract he was on.
There's something to announce. Like last time, some will like it, some will not like it too much. If it will not like it, stop watching now. I stay for another 2 years.
There's a very different mood among Liverpool's great rivals, Manchester United, who needed another moment of brilliance from Cristiano Ronaldo to avoid a third successive defeat on Thursday. They were hosting Chelsea at Old Trafford, and with half an hour to go, the European champions took the lead through Marcos Alonso. That advantage not lasting long. Ronaldo scoring his 5th goal in 3 games to salvage a 1-1 draw for United, and their interim manager Ralf Rangnick, he's being replaced by Ajax coach Erik ten Hag at the end of the season, while keeping a role at Old Trafford.
We haven't spoken, Erik and myself, but we have spoken with the board about the content and the profile of the job and the content of that consultancy role. We spoke about that, and that's why I can now confirm that I will definitely continue with that at the end of the season.
Earlier on Friday, it was confirmed that Rangnick has been named the new coach of Austria's men's national team. United with just 1 win from 7 games in all competitions. They're 6th in the Premier League table, but 5 points off the Champions League places, having played 2 games more than Arsenal and Tottenham. Okay, some breaking sports news just in the last few minutes. We're hearing that Reuters are reporting that 3-time Wimbledon tennis champion Boris Becker has been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Becker found guilty earlier this month of 4 breaches of the UK's Insolvency Act, including transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars after being declared bankrupt in 2017. He was also convicted of hiding a big bank loan and shares in a tech company. Each of those counts carried a potential maximum jail term of 7 years. Becker claimed the $50 million he made during his tennis career was spent on an expensive divorce, child maintenance, and his expensive lifestyle commitments. And the sentencing hearing was at Southwark Crown Court here in London earlier on Friday. And as we just mentioned, Reuters now reporting that Becker's been given a 2.5-year jail term. That's all we've got time for. Back to you with Connect the World.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I'll be back with more Connect the World right after this short break. Stay with CNN. Hello and welcome back to Connect the World. I'm Eleni Jarkas and I'm in for my colleague Becky Anderson. And we begin with another devastating blow to the already battered Ukrainian city of Mariupol. At least 600 people were injured in the heaviest Russian airstrikes yet to hit a steel plant there, where hundreds of civilians, including children, are holed up. The city's mayor says the bombing, which hit a makeshift hospital within the complex, is a war crime. This is video from inside that field hospital after bombardment by Russian troops. Now, CNN cannot independently verify exactly when this was taken. A military official describes what's unfolding inside.
I don't know the details. I know that a mission has arrived in Zaporizhia and that they are going to try and mount a rescue operation. These are hundreds of people and they have dozens of children with them. The youngest is 4 months old. Yesterday was a heavy strike on a direct hit on the field hospital that is situated inside Azov steel plant, and the operating theatre was hit directly, and all the surgical equipment, everything that is necessary to perform surgery has been destroyed. So right now we cannot treat our wounded.
And as he mentioned, all of this comes as a critical operation to rescue those still trapped in the plant begins. But that plan could already be doomed. A Ukrainian official saying Russian troops are blocking evacuations from parts of the complex. Also, in eastern Ukraine, the military reports heavy shelling in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Officials are accusing Russian troops of robbing one village of over 60 tons of wheat. And video shows trucks on fire at this key railway hub in Donetsk. It serves as a crucial supply line for Ukrainian troops. Meanwhile, the US and NATO say Russian troops are making slow and uneven progress in their ruthless assault on eastern Ukraine, but that they're learning from mistakes that they made during the early days of the war. And that has people in the south and eastern Ukraine bracing for the worst. We've got Nick Payton-Walsh following this from Kyiv. Thank you so much, Nick. Good to see you. We're hearing about imminent attacks close to where you are. Could you give me a sense of, firstly, the intel, and secondly, what we think the Russians are trying to achieve there?
Well, certainly the fear for here, Kryvyi Rih, the hometown of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, is that it may possibly face the brunt of the Russian attack that is certainly looming to the south of where I'm standing. We saw ourselves in the villages, in the expanses of rural farmland countryside to the south of this industrial hub. Quite how Russia's pushing forward in some areas, Ukraine is pushing back in others. It's extremely fluid, but I think there's no doubt that there is some motion in Russia's favour there, moving up the left-hand side of the Dnieper River's banks. Also possibly too some slight progress around the town of Mykolaiv. All important, all possibly the result of more forces being freed up as the agonising siege of Mariupol begins to wind towards an end. But here, certainly in the south of Kryvyi Rih, in the countryside there is continued motion, and this is what we saw there yesterday. If Moscow had any surprises left in this war, it is along here. The other side of the river has been Russia's for weeks, but here, the western side is caught in the fast-changing landscape of this week's push. That's the prize over there, the Dnieper River, up past which, on the left side bank here, the Russians are trying to push, wanting control of both sides of that vital part of Ukraine. Here in Novovoronskovo, we are told there are a handful of Russian tanks just over a kilometre away on its outskirts, pushing, probing, but ultimately kept at bay by Ukrainian forces that still hold the town. Resilience here embodied in Ludmila, under the threat of rocket fire, planting onions. I'm here until victory, she said.
Mama сейчас и я. Дети выехали.
Понятно. Her children have gone, it's just her and her mother. Сколько лет ваша мама?
80.
Okay, her 80-year-old mother and her are staying here.
Мама сказала, никуда не уеду, а я ее не брошу.
Her mother said she's not going anywhere and she's not going to leave her alone.
У меня окна целые пока, да.
All her windows are blown out, she says. Ukrainian forces who don't want their positions filmed are dotted around the town, as too are the signs of innocent lives lost here. Rockets peeking out from under the water. And this boat in which 14 civilians tried to flee Russian occupation on April the 7th, 4 of them died when Moscow's troops opened fire when it was 70 meters out. Yet still, the desperate keep fleeing. This morning, these women left behind their men to defend their homes near Novovorontsovka. We ran early in the morning, said Luda.
They didn't let us out. We're shields for them. They don't let us out, and by foot and by bicycle we go. In the fields we ran. Our soldiers were 2 kilometers away, Nadezhda adds, and we ran to them. What they need, the Russians take, she said. Take cars. They draw Zs on everything. As their new unwanted guests demanded milk and food at gunpoint, they had a glimpse of their warped mindset. They say they've come to liberate us, Luda said. These aggressors, that's what they told us. They say America is fighting here, but using the hands of Ukrainians to do it. That's what they say. Another claim to be fueled by the violence of the long war with separatists in the east. In general, the Donetsk militants say, she said, you have been bombing us for 8 years. Now we bomb you. Across the fields, loathing and artillery swallow whole once happy worlds.
What is unclear here is exactly what the ultimate goal of this southern offensive is. Yes, certainly there are fears that it's bound for here, Kryvyi Rih, but also too, Russia announced last week a lofty goal at the second phase of its offensive would be to head west from Kherson, the area where it has most of its forces gathered, towards the port city of Odessa, even possibly towards the border with Moldova, where in the breakaway separatist region of Transnistria we've seen heightened activity, the possibility, many speculating that might be to suggest some kind of Russian move there, possibly a distraction. Possibly, though, some analysts saying the better money is on these forces moving north along that riverbank to head east and join up with the other offensive that seemed to be making slow progress for Russia in the east of the country. A lot of that, though, leaving people here deeply concerned because of the fluidity of what's happening and the violence that it unleashes.
Yeah, and it's such a good point because Odessa would be a very key geography for the Russians. But we've heard from the US saying that the Russian progress has been slow as well as uneven. And then one has to also take into consideration their military firepower and their capabilities after hearing the defense secretary of the US saying, look, the Russian military has already been weakened to some extent as they've lost some precision equipment that's not easily replaced.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously the military fighting this campaign is one that is possibly better knowledgeable of the enemy that it faces and, frankly, its own weaknesses, its own inability to resupply itself. But it's one that's already lost thousands, possibly tens of thousands, if you listen to some of the more pessimistic for Russia accounts of its best troops. And so the military here are, it seems, certainly in the south, a mixture of Donetsk and Luhansk separatist militants, some units of regular Russian military from Buryatia, even talk of Chechens as well. It's more of a hodgepodge, and some units that have been put back together again after being heavily hit in the failed offensive around Kiev. So it's a weakened Russian military, strengthened by perhaps better knowledge, but one that probably doesn't have an infinite level of resources to achieve its tasks. So the question essentially is, what is their ultimate goal? What is the thing that the Kremlin feel they need to achieve to announce some kind of victory? And frankly, will Ukraine stop fighting back? On Ukraine's side, they're increasingly getting better and larger amounts of Western supplied weaponry, and that does enable them to push back. So we are going to see, I fear, in the months ahead, continued fighting.
Nick Payton-Walsh, thank you very much. Now, for weeks, we've seen the destruction in eastern Ukraine as Russia intensifies its attacks, and now claims from Ukraine that Russians are robbing their farmers' wheat in stocks in the south. The Ukrainian Armed Forces General Staff says Russian troops robbed more than 60 tons of wheat and cargo trucks from an agricultural cooperative in the Zaporizhia region. The war is putting a big strain on the global food supply, and the World Bank warns the food and energy price shocks that we're seeing could last for years, and it has just released its first comprehensive analysis of the war's impact on commodity markets. Now, energy prices are set to increase by a whopping 50% this year. Wheat is forecast to increase by 42.7% and reach new record highs in dollar terms. The World Bank writes the increase in energy prices over the past 2 years has been the largest since the 1973 oil crisis. Price increases for food commodities, of which Russia and Ukraine are large producers, and fertilizers, which rely on natural gas as a production input, have been the largest since 2008. I want to talk more about this with the president of the World Bank Group, David Malpass, joining us from Washington, D.C. David, really good to see you. To be honest, reading this report and the outlook, it's one of the most grim reports I've read in a very long time and very concerning. What is worrying you the most out of your forecasts? And is this a conservative report, or can you say comfortably that you've priced in the worst case scenarios?
Hi, Eleni. Well, the most concerning is the suddenness of the spike in prices and the shortages in wheat and foodstuffs and fertilizer. Energy in winter countries it means people are cold, but when their food is missing, it means children aren't eating, and that's a concern in many parts of the developing world. This forecast is meant to project out commodity prices. Obviously, no one can forecast very far into the future. It depends a lot on what the supply is going to be in other countries to make up for the losses in Russia and in Ukraine. And that is yet to be determined. If you say how much fertilizer is going to be made over the next 6 months, it depends a lot on the policies of the exporting countries and the producing countries. We saw palm oil exports cut by Indonesia. That's a big disappointment, and that affects cooking oil prices around the world.
Yeah, and if you look at the lockdowns in China, that creates other supply constraints. But, I guess since we've seen these kind of cycles before where you see enormous price shocks like we saw in the 70s, what tools are there that we could use to mitigate some of this short-term impact? I know that you're looking at a 15-month crisis financing target of around $170 billion. How can that be put to work to try and alleviate the pain?
We will be putting money in to help production. We also finance trade credits. That's where businesses borrow short-term money and use it to increase supply. So those can help. It also matters a lot what the regulatory policies are around the world on the supply side. It's going to be critical for markets to know that their production is going to be welcome out into the future. Markets look ahead, so the big investments that are needed have to be made with the idea that there's going to be a use for their production 10 years forward. That's especially true in energy. So the policies on energy production are going to be one of the biggest variables in getting through this crisis and getting to the other side. You're right, China is a big swing factor in production of all sorts of goods. So their shutdowns are hurting the supplies of various commodities around the world. The other countries can make up for those, but there has to be a conducive environment for production, for new investment. We do that in developing countries, and we encourage it in the advanced economies.
Ukraine has seen $60 billion, according to your report, worth of damages, infrastructure damages. Every single day, we're hearing about more infrastructure damage. Today, we heard that Russian military are taking wheat from warehouses. Does this mean if we take out more wheat from these scenarios that have been mapped out, even US President Joe Biden said that they're going to try and get logistics back up and running to get more grain out of Ukraine. If we take more volume out, what does this actually mean for food insecurity in the most vulnerable of areas around the world?
It would help if enough food can be taken out. We're working on the transport systems. The border from Ukraine into Poland is a very important one for the rail transit, but they don't use the same gauge railroads, and so it means that cargoes have to be transshipped. These are logistics difficulties, big challenges, and the volume of food available in Ukraine for export is way beyond the capacity of the land routes. They need to reopen the sea routes through the Black Sea, but those have been severely hurt by the war. These are all topics that are under discussion of how do you solve the shortages that are coming out. And I say again, It's very important for markets to have confidence that their supply will be needed into the future. The long-term planning of the investment cycle is one of the most important factors right now.
David, the US economy shrank in the first quarter. We're seeing, similar numbers coming through from Europe in terms of much lower growth scenarios. This year was meant to be a post-COVID, growth year. We've used every single tool, monetary policy tool available, fiscal tool available. It's caused a bit of inflation, compounded now by supply shortages. What is left in terms of what countries can do to pull them out of this new huge uncertainty that's facing the global economy?
There are actually a lot more tools to use as far as how do you stimulate supply. If you're facing an inflation problem and a slow growth or negative growth problem, the thing to do is to create more, to get people working and companies investing. And so the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan, the ECB, are still in the old mode where their policies were meant to accommodate and encourage demand. And I think there needs to be a big shift toward encouraging supply through better regulatory policy and a change in the asset mix of the major central banks. They're owning bonds, and I think it would be much better if they were owning short-term instruments. That way, they wouldn't be crowding out the private sector the way they are now in their choice of capital allocation. It's vital as we go forward that markets see that there's going to be more and more capital allocated to new businesses, women-owned businesses, small businesses, developing country businesses in order to create the supply that's much needed.
There are huge issues with unsustainable debt burdens across low-income countries and middle-income countries, mostly exacerbated by the pandemic. And the prognosis is that the biggest countries that are going to be impacted in terms of economic shocks are again the most vulnerable countries. Are you thinking about debt alleviation or suspension of debt repayments at this point in time, specifically for the most vulnerable?
I think that's necessary for some of the poorest countries. Their debts are just unsustainable. And so there's no benefit to the world of trying to collect from countries that aren't able to pay, and especially from the people of those countries that don't even have enough food to be making interest payments on debts that were arranged years ago with a different government to a different global climate. So we need to have more adjustment going on in the global debt system. That was a major topic of our spring meetings last week of the IMF and the World Bank here in Washington. And I think there are more steps to go to have a process that will work in two ways. One is to restructure the existing debts that are unsustainable, and two, going forward, to have more transparency in the lending conditions, the borrowing conditions that countries are facing, so they don't keep getting into this debt crisis.
And at the World Bank IMF meetings, we saw some countries walking out when Russian delegates started speaking. I know that you've stopped new projects and loans to Russia, but are you planning to suspend Russia from your institution?
We stopped lending actually in 2014 after their Crimea invasion. The articles of the World Bank don't allow for a political suspension. It needs to be from the shareholders as they work as a group. So we're listening to our shareholders and watching how they proceed. I think that idea of excluding Russia will be more possible in other institutions as the world looks at the things that are necessary given Russia's invasion, a horrible invasion of Ukraine. There are other institutions where this will lead, and then the World Bank shareholders will be talking about it, thinking about it, and as you say, walking out of the meetings as they did last week.
David Malpass, thank you very much for your time and your insights. It's a really important time to talk about the economic ramifications of this war. Great to have you on. Now, Russia's war on Ukraine is an attack on world security. Strong words from Ukraine's Prime Minister after bombs hit Kyiv while the UN chief is in town. And a little later this hour, energy security in Europe as it tries to stand tough against its major gas supplier, Russia. I'll be talking to an expert on what Europe is facing. That's coming up later in the show. Ukraine's president is calling for a powerful response after he says Russia bombed Kyiv while UN chief Antonio Guterres was wrapping up his visit there. President Volodymyr Zelensky says 5 missiles hit the capital in the attack Thursday night. Several people were injured when officials say one of the missiles hit an apartment building. Ukrainian officials are condemning these strikes. The president's office saying it's more proof that the world must unite around Ukraine. CNN's Matt Rivers reports from Kyiv.
Well, this right behind me is the site of that missile strike where Ukrainian officials say Russian cruise missiles hit during the evening hours on Thursday afternoon. At least one woman was killed as a result of this strike. Her body found by rescuers who arrived at the scene going through the rubble earlier in the day on Friday. We know that at least 6 people also now hospitalized with various injuries, including carbon monoxide poisoning from a fire that broke out here as a result of that missile strike. Now, we're very close to a factory that Russia says it was actually targeting with this strike. Russia's Ministry of Defense saying that they were targeting a factory that produces, as one of the top producers here in Ukraine, of air-to-air guided missiles as well as aircraft parts. That factory was also damaged. We can't show you that factory due to Ukrainian law. It is close by to where we are right now. But look, this is another example of Russia saying they're striking a target with a supposed military relevance, and yet this, the damage, the primary damage from this strike, has no military relevance. This is an apartment building where ordinary people live, where a 54-year-old woman was killed. She was working here in Kyiv as a journalist for a radio station. Yet another example of Russian missiles killing ordinary civilians. And keep in mind, this also happened right behind me when the UN Secretary General was in town. He was here for talks with President Zelensky and his administration. He had just come from Moscow, where he was trying to work with the Russians to open up humanitarian corridors to get people out of some of the besieged areas of Ukraine. And then in the second part of that trip, he was here in Kyiv. If you were hoping for some sort of breakthrough between the United Nations and Russia, this is the message that Russia chose to send while the UN Secretary General was in town. Matt Rivers, CNN in Kyiv.
Well, Ukraine could be getting a massive shot in the arm to help fight the Russians. U.S. President Joe Biden is asking Congress to approve more than $30 billion in new aid. But Ukraine would not be the only beneficiary. CNN's Alex Marquardt shows us who stands to make a lot of money off the deal.
As Russian troops poured across Ukraine's border, kicking off the Russian invasion in late February, something else was happening at the same time in New York. The stock prices of the biggest U.S. weapons manufacturers spiked, many eventually climbing to their highest point in years.
War is good business for parts of the economy, historically. It doesn't mean the defense contractors cynically want it. I know a lot of people in these companies, and they're as heartbroken by the war in Ukraine as the next person. But yes, war is good business for certain parts of the economy.
The latest American weapons shipments to Ukraine include systems like scores of 155mm howitzers that haven't been sent before, Switchblade and Ghost drones, hundreds of armored personnel carriers joining the now well-known and brutally effective Javelins and Stingers on Ukraine's battlefields.
Sometimes we will speak softly and carry a large javelin because we're sending a lot of those in as well.
Javelins are made in part by Raytheon, whose CEO said last month they do expect to benefit from the need to replenish U.S. stocks.
We don't apologize for making these systems, making these weapons. The fact is they are incredibly effective in deterring and dealing with the threat that the Ukrainians are seeing today. Eventually, we'll have to replenish it, and we will see a benefit to the business over the next coming years.
Raytheon, along with 7 other weapons companies, including Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, met earlier this month with top Pentagon brass in a classified meeting about not just supplying Ukraine, but replenishing U.S. and allied inventories.
I'm not going to deny that these kinds of conflicts can help certain companies. It's the reality of the situation, but we should also be glad, to the extent we want to help Ukraine, we should be glad we have this industrial base that's capable of producing this stuff on short notice with such high quality.
The Biden administration alone has contributed almost $3.5 billion of military aid to Ukraine in the 2 months of Russia's war. Compared to the Pentagon's 2023 requested budget for weapons, that's just 1.2%. Critics say the Pentagon and contractors could use the Ukraine conflict to justify bigger budgets and more weapons sales.
My concern is when those weapons are replenished, will it be at a reasonable cost? Will the contractors gouge the taxpayer? And also, will there be ancillary changes in our military spending that don't really relate to Ukraine, but are used because of the fear related to the Russian invasion to spend on things that really don't have to do with the defense of Europe?
There are also concerns about where the billions of dollars of weapons are going. Once they cross the border into Ukraine, officials say the U.S. has no way to track the weapons, nor, of course, where they end up in the long run.
Once it gets into Ukrainian hands, it's up to the Ukrainian armed forces to decide where it goes, what unit gets it, when, where it's stored, if it's stored at all temporarily. That is up to the Ukrainians to decide, not the United States.
In the $33 billion of Ukraine funding that President Joe Biden requested on Thursday, more than a third of it, $11.4 billion, would be allocated towards replenishing the U.S. weapons inventory and money for Ukraine to buy more weapons. That's where the new business for these weapons companies will come from, and there will be more. So a major concern now is making sure that weapons companies don't take advantage of this crisis, of this moment, to raise their prices. Alex Marquardt, CNN, Washington.
And we're just learning that the US is sending more than a dozen flights loaded with military assistance to Europe over the next 24 hours, all of them heading for Ukraine. Now, Vladimir Putin has accepted an invitation to attend the G20 summit in November on the Indonesian island of Bali. The Russian president was invited to the summit by his Indonesian counterpart, Joko Widodo. In a statement, President Widodo says his country wants to unite the G20. He also invited Ukraine's president to the summit. Volodymyr Zelensky has not said yet if he will attend. And just ahead, Europe's got a big problem. It wants to help Ukraine, but it relies on Russian energy. Find out why my next guest says the continent is in what he calls a very severe situation. Energy warfare. It looks like that is Vladimir Putin's new front. In his unprovoked war on Ukraine, this week the Russian leader cut off natural gas supplies to Bulgaria and Poland in what the EU calls blackmail. The EU is split over how to respond to Moscow's demand that its gas be paid for in rubles. Keep in mind, Russia is a key producer of coal, oil and natural gas, and bearing down on energy warfare policies could pitch Europe into recession. At the same time, the World Bank is warning of the worst commodity shock in 50 years. The possibility of countries like Qatar, for example, replacing Russian gas supplies in the near term is limited by, among other things, a complicated production and transportation process. Without a network of pipelines from places like Qatar to Europe, natural gas must first be purified and converted into a liquefied form so it can be shipped. This liquefied natural gas, or LNG, is created through a specialized cooling process. Then it is carried on a massive tanker, ships, and transported to processing terminals. Those terminals then convert the liquid back to a gaseous state, so it can be delivered to consumers through pipelines. Germany, for one, currently doesn't have any such facilities. It's announced the construction of 2 terminals, but those could take years to build. My next guest says, and I quote, "Without Russian gas, we are probably in the worst situation we've ever been." Torben Brabo is the Senior Vice President of Energinet, Denmark's gas transmission system operator. He's also President of Gas Infrastructure Europe and is responsible for LNG operators on the continent. He joins me now live from Copenhagen. Really good to see you. I mean, honestly, your warning is something that a lot of people have been fearing. I want you to give me a sense of what Russian gas out of Europe would mean for the continent.
Sure. Thank you for having us. Under these sad and unprecedented times, our thoughts go to Ukraine. On gas, which constitute 25% of the primary energy consumption in Europe, 40% comes from Russia. And that is severe if we're lacking, let's say, 40% of our gas consumption. Combined, it's 10% of the total energy consumption in the European Union, that is the Russian gas. Naturally, we have prepared, let's say, for decades for security of supply, markets, etc., but relying, let's say, on a lot of import sources, Norwegian, North African LNG, and also Russian gas. So we have never thought we should be in this situation, neither war in Europe nor this situation in the gas sector.
I want you to give me a sense in terms of the volume of gas that's been coming through from Russia since the war started. Have you seen any disruptions? Have you seen an increase in demand? And give me a sense of the supply-demand dynamics, keeping in mind we know that now Poland and Bulgaria have been cut off.
Yeah, sure. So the Russian supplies have actually been fairly stable. So every morning at 9 o'clock, the European gas transmission system operators meet in a crisis call, and we spread information from all the countries. We could also do it, let's say, in real time if, let's say, something more urgent happens. So we have received very stable Russian supplies through the pipelines, and now they have cut off, let's say, for Bulgaria and also for Poland. In the meantime, we have seen that already in March, 8th of March, the European Commission came, let's say, with a proposal to mitigating both the energy crisis of last year and then, let's say, the more severe war situation we're having now. So they are, let's say, protecting residential consumers for the energy bills. They are allowed to use state aid guidance, subsidies for these consumers. They push really for renewables. So a part of, let's say, the solution is also more wind and more sun. And then we are also, let's say, assessing how we can redefine the natural gas supply. I can come back to that. We will lose a lot of Russian gas, and we can look how we can get additional sources. LNG, you just said, from US or Middle East, that's by far the biggest. So Russia delivers 150 billion cubic meters of gas, and we consider to import 1/3 of that in additional LNG volumes. That is probably a bit too optimistic. We assess from the European gas facilities, can we produce more there and get more gas from Norway or from Algeria also. So we have, let's say, a good toolbox of 8 to 10 different tools that we are, let's say, assessing, and they can be used differently in the different European countries.
I want to ask you very quickly about payment for gas in rubles. And are you concerned that that is going to create tension between European countries, and it's sort of a ploy by the Russians to create tension in Europe, would you say?
So my job is, let's say, to be the independent system operator. So we're not into the commercial business. So we simply just accept some of the facts. But I know that some of the European energy companies, they have, let's say, set up mechanisms so they can actually pay in rubles, and then with an intermediate bank, and then the Russians see this payment as being done in rubles. The European counterparties do it in euros. We have seen few companies do that. I don't know whether more companies are willing to do it.
Yeah. Very quickly, are you forecasting in your worst case scenarios that you're putting in terms of scenario planning, a recession in Europe if the taps are turned off by Russia?
So we are not at that point yet. Right now, we are 2 months into the conflict. We have actually received a lot of gas from Russia. It is on store. All the countries are, let's say, for themselves, let's say, protecting themselves and the consumers for the next winter. We see a lot of different opportunities. So to some extent, we might be in a situation where we could meet the coming winter less severe than we actually feared. But also have in mind that all these investments going on for biomethane and hydrogen will also, let's say, assist not only in the short term, but also, let's say, help Europe become even more, let's say, decarbonized in the longer run.
Yeah. Torbjørn Brabo, thank you very much. Great to have you on the show. Much appreciated.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, and ahead on the show. People in Shanghai, China, under one of the world's strictest lockdowns, make their voices heard. We'll tell you why they are banging their pots in protest. Right now, at least 27 cities across China are under some degree of COVID lockdown. Shanghai, a city of 25 million, has been under one of the world's strictest lockdowns for weeks. About 12 million are now allowed to leave their homes. Late Thursday, a banging your pots protest rang out over the city. People have not been able to leave their homes or neighborhoods and have been relying on the government to bring them food and medicine. Many say it has been insufficient and inequitable. Still, China is defending its zero-COVID strategy as, quote, magic weapon. Celine Wan is in Kunming in southwestern China. And Selena, great to see you. And I know you've had your fair share of trying to travel around and experiencing the relentless testing and some of the bureaucracy. But honestly, I don't think we've ever kind of seen this very vocal response by people in China, the banging of pots. We've seen so many videos of their experiences. What is government's response right now, given the discontent?
Well, the government censors, Eleni, they are struggling to keep up with the volume of complaints coming from Shanghai. These desperate stories of people still, after this more than month-long lockdown, many still struggling to get enough food and medical care. But despite this overwhelming frustration from Shanghai officials, actually they're doubling down on this zero COVID policy. And many observers may say it's more about politics than science in some ways. Chinese leader Xi Jinping, he's put his personal stamp on this zero COVID policy. And the official stance has been that this policy has enabled China to keep COVID death rates low, and that if they were not to have this policy, you would see deaths and cases skyrocket like they have in other parts of the world. It's also part of the propaganda machine, part of the leadership's reasoning for why they think their system is superior. But we're also seeing lockdowns across China, at least 27 cities in some sort of lockdown. That's impacting around 180 million people. That's more than half of the US population. It's not just Shanghai and Beijing that are dealing with these struggles. And meanwhile, in Beijing, so far, the partial lockdowns, the mass testing seem to be more organized than they were in Shanghai. The officials in Beijing, they're desperate to avoid the chaos and failures of the Shanghai lockdown. But still, residents, they're getting nervous. More and more compounds and venues, they're getting locked down because of positive COVID cases. They've been tested 3 times in just the span of a week. More than 21 million residents tested multiple times over and over again. They are stocking up on goods. There's been some panic buying. They're trying to prepare for what may be worse to come. Eleni.
Yeah, I mean, and the government is calling it its magic weapon, this zero COVID policy. But what do we understand about the profile of this specific outbreak in terms of hospitalization rates and deaths?
Well, if we're talking about the Shanghai COVID-19 cases, they have climbed down from more than 20,000. Now they're more than 10,000. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the numbers are quite low. In fact, after rounds of mass testing since Friday, they've only detected less than 300 COVID-19 cases. But what officials are worried about is how quickly these cases can spiral, as they saw in Shanghai, from just a few dozen to tens of thousands. But of course, these are just reported cases in China. They're always have to be taken with a dose of skepticism. Another really big challenge, though, about the way that these cases are being handled, and which we saw in Shanghai, is that every single positive case has to be sent to a government quarantine facility. And as we've seen, many of them are in extremely poor condition. Eleni?
All right, Selena, great to have you on. Thank you so very much. CNN's David Culver is one of millions of people enduring this weeks-long lockdown in Shanghai. Here is a look inside his life.
This is a look at my live setup in my apartment. The camera equipment all sent in from my photographer in Beijing.